Encyclopedia section 412. Implicitly, the soul shows the untruth and unreality of matter. For the soul, in its concentrated self, cuts itself off from its immediate being, placing the latter over against it as a corporeity incapable of offering resistance to its molding influence. The soul thus setting in opposition its being to its conscious self, absorbing it and making it its own, has lost the meaning of mere soul, or the immediacy of mind. The actual soul, with its sensation and its concrete self feeling, turned into habit, has implicitly realized the ideality of its qualities. In this externality, it has recollected and inwardized itself and is infinite self relation. This free universality, thus made explicit, shows the soul awaking to the higher stage of the ego or abstract universality insofar it is for the abstract universality. In this way, it gains the position of thinker and subject, especially a subject of the judgment in which the ego excluded from itself the sum total of its merely natural features as an object, a world external to it, but with such respect to that object that in it the object is immediately reflected into itself. The soul rises to become consciousness. Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness. Encyclopedia section 413. Consciousness constitutes that reflected or correlational grade of mind. The grade of mind as appearance. Ego is infinite self relation of mind, but as subjective or as self certainty. The immediate identity of the natural soul has been raised to this self subsistent reflection, set forth as an object. The pure abstract freedom of mind lets go from it its specific qualities, the soul's natural life, to an equal freedom as an independent object. It is of this latter, as external to it, that the ego is in the first instance aware, conscious, and as such it is consciousness. Ego, as this absolute negativity, is implicitly cancelled. It is one side of the relationship and the whole relationship, the light which manifests itself in something else too. In Arabic, the soul is called ruh, and the ego is called nafs. And this ego is what we are calling mind or spirit. Encyclopedia section 414. The self identity of the mind, thus first made explicit as the ego, is only its abstract formal identity. As soul, it was under the phase of substantial universality. Am I not your Lord? You are. Now, as subjective reflection in itself, it is referred to this substantiality as to its negative, something dark and beyond it. Hence, consciousness, like reciprocal dependence in general, is the contradiction between the independence of the two sides of their identity in which they are merged into one. The mind as ego is essence. But since reality in the sphere of essence is represented as in immediate being and at the same time as ideal, it is as consciousness only the appearance phenomenon of mind. Encyclopedia section 415. As the ego is by itself only a formal identity, the dialectical movement of its intelligible unity, in essence, the successive steps in further specification of consciousness, does not to it seem to be its own activity, but is implicit. And to the ego it seems an alteration of the object. Consciousness consequently appears differently modified according to the difference of that consequently consciousness consequently appears differently modified according to the difference of the given object, and the gradual specification of consciousness appears as a variation in the characteristics of its objects. Ego, the subject of consciousness, is thinking. The logical process of modifying the object is what is identical in subject and object. Their absolute interdependence, what makes the subject's own. Encyclopedia section 416. The aim of conscious mind is to make its appearance identical with its essence, to raise its self certainty to truth. The existence of mind in the stage of consciousness is finite because it is merely a nominal self relation or mere certainty, mumkinat. The object is only abstractly characterized as its. In other words, in the object, it is only as an abstract ego that the mind is reflected into itself. Hence, its existence there has still a content which is not as its own. Al-Makhayal. Encyclopedia section 417. The grades of this elevation of certainty to truth are three in number. First, A. Consciousness in general, with an object set against it. B. Self consciousness, for which ego is the object. C. Unity of consciousness and self consciousness, where the mind sees itself embodied in the object and sees itself as implicitly and explicitly determinate, as reason, the notion of mind. A is fana, B is baqa, C is fanafi baqa. Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, Supersection A, Consciousness Proper, das Bewusstsein a el Sol es. A. Das Sinnliche Bewusstsein, Metasection Alpha, Sensuous Consciousness. Encyclopedia section 418. Consciousness is, first, immediate consciousness, and its reference to the object accordingly. Consciousness is, first, immediate consciousness, and its reference to the object accordingly. The simple and underived certainty of it, the object similarly, being immediate and existent, reflected in itself, is further characterized as immediately singular, the in sense consciousness. Encyclopedia section 419. The sensible as somewhat becomes an other. The reflection in itself of this somewhat, the thing, has many predicates. The muchness of the sense singular thus become a breath, a variety of relations, reflectional attributes, and universalities. These are logical terms introduced by the thinking principle, in essence, in this case by the ego, to describe the sensible. But the ego as itself apparent sees in all this characterization a change in the object, and self consciousness, so construing the object, is self perception. Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, Supersection A, Consciousness proper, das Bewusstsein als solches, das sinnliche Bewusstsein, Metasection Beta, Sense Perception, Wahrnehmung. Encyclopedia section 420, Consciousness, having passed beyond the sensibility, wants to take the object in its truth, not merely immediate, but as mediated, reflected in itself, and universal. Such an object is a combination of sense qualities, with attributes of wider range by which thought defines concrete relations and connections. Hence, the identity of consciousness with the object passes from the abstract identity of I am sure to the definite identity of I know and am aware. Encyclopedia section 421, this conjunction of individual and universal is admixture. The individual remains at the bottom, hard and unaffected by the universal, to which, however, it is related. It is there a tissue of contradictions between the single things of sense apperception, which form the alleged ground of general experience, and the universality which has a higher claim to be the essence and ground. Between the individuality of a thing which, taken in its concrete content, constitutes its independence, and the various properties which, free from this negative link and from another, are independent universal matters. This contradiction of the finite, which runs through all forms of the logical spheres, turns out most concrete when the somewhat is defined as object. See for reference the Coptic Christian Church and their understanding of the nature of the Christ or of Jesus Christ. See also from the similar region the Waldifa or Waldifa, translated again by Sheikh Hamim Keller, and all of the interlocutive verses which accompany it. This is the litanies of the Shadali Tariqa. Both of these attempt to, or both of these answer this question, and I believe Encyclopedia section 421 is familiar with both of those sources. Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, Supersection A, Consciousness Proper, das Bewusstsein als solches, das sinnliche Bewusstsein, Metasection Gamma, the Intellect, der Verstand. Encyclopedia section 422, the proximate truth of perception is that it is the object which is an appearance, and that the object's reflection in self is, on the contrary, a self subsistent, inward, and universal. The consciousness of such an object is intellect. This inward, as we called it, of the thing is on one hand the suppression of the multiplicity of the sensible, and in that manner an abstract identity. On the other hand, however, it also for that reason contains the multiplicity, but as an interior simple difference, which remains self identical in the multiplicity, but as an anterior simple difference which remains self identical in the vicissitudes of appearance. On the other hand, however, it also for that reason contains the multiplicity, but as an interior simple but as an interior simple difference, which remains self identical in the vicissitudes of appearance. This simple difference is the realm of the laws of the phenomena, a copy of the phenomenon, but brought to rest in universality. Encyclopedia section 423, the law, at first stating the mutual dependence of universal, permanent terms, has, insofar as its distinction is the inward one, it's necessary on its own part. The one of the terms, as not externally different from the other, lies immediately in the other, but in this manner the interior distinction is what it is in truth, the distinction on its own part, or the distinction which is none. With this new form, characteristic, on the whole, consciousness implicitly vanishes. For consciousness as such implies the reciprocal independence of subject and object. The ego, in its judgment, has an object which is not distinct from it. It has itself. Consciousness has passed into self consciousness. Ana maratu habibi. Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, Supersection B, Self-Consciousness, Selbesta Bewusstsein. Encyclopedia section 424, Self-consciousness is the truth of consciousness. The latter is a consequence of the former, all consciousness of an other object being as a matter of fact also self-consciousness. The object is my idea. I am aware of the object as mine, and thus in it I am aware of me. The formula of self consciousness is I equals I in relation to negative abstract freedom, pure ideality. Insofar it lacks reality. For as it is its own object, there is strictly speaking no object, because there is no distinction between it and the object. Encyclopedia section 425. Abstract self consciousness is the first negation of consciousness, and for that reason it is burdened with an external object, or nominally with the negation of it. Thus, it is at the same time the antecedent stage, consciousness and as consciousness. But the latter aspect and the negation in general is in I equals I potentially suppressed. And hence, as this certitude of self against the object, it is the impulse to realize its implicit nature. By giving its abstract self awareness content and objectivity, and in the other direction to free itself from its sensuousness, to set aside the given objectivity and identify with itself. The two processes are one and the same, the identification of its consciousness and self consciousness. I am as my servant believes me to be. Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, Supersection B, Self Consciousness, Selbesta Bewusstsein, Metasection Alpha, Appetite or Instinctive Desire, Liebig Gi Arda, Encyclopedia section 426. Self consciousness in its immediacy is a singular and a desire, appetite. The contradiction implied in its abstraction, which should yet be objective, or in its immediacy, which has the shape of an external object and should be subjective. The certitude of one's self which issues from the suppression of mere consciousness, pronounces the object null, and the outlook of self consciousness towards the object equally qualified. The abstract ideality of such self consciousness is null. God is mine, not yours. Encyclopedia section 427. Self consciousness, therefore, knows itself implicit in the object, which in this outlook is conformable to the appetite, in negation of the two one sided moments. By the ego's own activity, this identity comes to be for the ego. To this activity, the object, which implicitly and for the self consciousness is selfless, can make no resistance. The dialectic implicit in it toward self suppression exists in this case as that activity of the ego. Thus, while the given object is rendered subjective, the subjectivity divests itself of its one sidedness and becomes objective to itself. Encyclopedia section 428. The product of this process is the fast conjunction of the ego with itself, its satisfaction realized, and itself made actual. On the external side, it continues in this return upon itself, primarily describable as an individual, and maintains itself as such because its bearing upon the selfless object is purely negative, the latter therefore being merely consumed. Thus, appetite in its satisfaction is always destructive, and in its content selfish. And as the satisfaction has only happened in the individual, and that is transient, the appetite is again generated in the very act of satisfaction. Encyclopedia section 429. But on the inner side, or implicitly, the sense of self which the ego gets in the satisfaction does not remain in abstract self concentration or in mere individuality. On the contrary, as negation of immediacy and individuality, the result involves a character of universality and of the identity of self consciousness with its object. The judgment of deremption of this self consciousness is the consciousness of a free object, in which ego is aware of itself as an ego, which, however, is also still outside it. Subsection B, and later we'll get to the concept of projection. I see you negative traits, but only in that person. Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness. Supersection B, Self Consciousness, Sylvester Bewusstsein. Metasection Beta, Self Consciousness, Recognitive, and the Telepathic Spy. Das Anerkennende Sylvester Bewusstsein. Encyclopedia and Arkanen de Sylvester Bewusstsein. Encyclopedia section 420. Here, there is a self consciousness for a self consciousness, at first immediately as one of two things for another. In that other, as ego, I behold myself, and yet also an immediately existing object, another ego absolutely independent of me and opposed to me. The suppression of the singleness of self consciousness was only a first step in suppression, and it merely led to the characterization of it as particular. This contradiction gives either self consciousness the impulse to show itself as a free self, and to exist as such for the other, the process of recognition. Encyclopedia section 431. The process is a battle. Jihad the nafs. I cannot be aware of me as myself and another individual, so long as I see in that other and an immediate existence. And I am consequently bent upon the suppression of this immediacy of his. But in like measure, I cannot be recognized as immediate, except so far as I overcome the mere immediacy on my own part, and thus give existence to my freedom. But this immediacy is at the same time the corporeity of self consciousness, in which, as in its sign and tool, the latter has its own sense of self, and its being for others, and the means for entering into relation with them. Encyclopedia section 432. The fight of recognition is a life and death struggle. Either self consciousness imperils the others like, and incurs a like peril for its own, but only peril, for either is no less bent on maintaining his life as the existence of his freedom. Thus, the death of one, though by the abstract, therefore rude, negation of immediacy, it from one point of view solves the contradiction, is yet from the essential point of view, in essence, the outward and visible recognition, a new contradiction, for that recognition is as the same time undone by the other's death, and a greater than the other. Encyclopedia section 433. But because life is as requisite as liberty to the solution, the fight ends in the first instance as a one sided negation with inequality. While the one combatant prefers life, retains his single self consciousness, but surrenders his claim for recognition, the other holds fast to his self assertion and is recognized by the former as his superior. Thus arises the status of master and slave. Encyclopedia section 434. This status, in the first place, implies common wants and common concern for their satisfaction. For the means of mastery, the slave must likewise be kept in life. In place of the rude destruction of the immediate object, there ensues acquisition, preservation, and formation of it, as instrumentality in which the two extremes of independence and non independence are welded together. The form of universality thus arising in satisfying wants creates a permanent means and a provision which takes care for and secures the future. Encyclopedia section 435. But secondly, when we look to the distinction of the two, the master beholds in the slave and his servitude the supremacy of his single selfhood, and that by the suppression of immediate selfhood, a suppression, however, which falls on another, this other, the slave, however, in the service of the master, works off his individualist self will, overcomes the inner immediacy of appetite, and in this divestment of self, and in the fear of his Lord, makes the beginning of wisdom, the passage to universal self consciousness or overmind.